Okay, so ladies and gentlemen, dear colleagues, thank you for joining us at this high-level international experts discussion that is organized in order to bring three outstanding experts together. Thanks for joining us, Mr. Timo Güll from the International Energy Agency, and Stefan Hallegatte. Our topic today is the international dimension of energy transition. And by this we mean replacing energy produced by producing CO2 in alternative means. And this asks a number of questions. And if you have been already a member of some of the discussions, what we had here is we as Austrian National Bankers, national banker, are not the primary drivers of the energy policy development. We are more a price taker, but as a price taker, we have a strong interest of understanding how it's happening, but we also have a strong interest to raise our hand if we have the feeling that it doesn't go away what our economic thinking and I would say our professional consensus suggests. And the impact on us, it's relatively clear. If and as energy transition takes place, it will change the relative prices. This may have an impact on price level. And as it impacts price level, it's right down our alley because we are responsible for price level stabilization. But it also impacts us with regard to the financial markets, because financial market stability is also part of our mandate. And so we want to make sure through our supervisory process, but more broadly to special stress tests and special review features that the financial market takes account the risk of energy transition. And last but not least, energy transition requires money, requires financing, and financing not only within a country, but across an area, but also across regions, which has an impact on our macroeconomic performance. And this is also part of our agenda, not least because we're also members of the IMF, where international financial flows have an importance. As we started out discussing energy, we had invited already a number of technicians, some coming from the economic world, some coming from the physical world. And what we found out is that, well, that economists have different views. That's relatively often. It happens even within the Austrian National Bank. But we always thought, when it comes to technical studies, there should be a broad agreement, what works, what doesn't work, what the conditions are. But as a colleague of mine from Croatia, Boris Vucic, remarked that he found out that technicians also don't have the same opinion. And so he started out inviting technicians in order to compare and in order to help him to form a better understanding. So he said, okay, that's a kind of a process that should also work for us. And that's the reason why we have invited a number of people. And today, those three people, of which one is already present, two are still waiting.
No, two are already present. Mr. Stefan Hallegatte is already present.
It's already present. Okay, so we have now two present, one still missing, so we could start them. But before doing so, I would still like to raise a few missed through questions which emerge, which how to say, bother us, and we should think about it. The one is, at the moment, if one reads papers, also produced from even outside, one has the feeling, okay, at the moment we have essentially two technologies which are considered to save the world, which is wind energy and sun energy, and that's it. Here the question then is, okay, fine. The question is, does it add up the production what we have in the country? And if it adds up the production we could do, the question is, should we do it in a country? Because one of the first laws, if not the first law of economics, was the comparative advantage. So, and even if it can do it physically, it makes it economically sense. And then if it makes economically sense in principle, then the question is, what are the transport routes? How are you able to transport some of this electricity there? One of the questions then is, if you do it, how does the financing take place? How to guarantee property rights? One of the questions then also is, on the way to it, okay, now we can move towards, let's say, a new energy. Think about batteries. Then the question is, okay, how many battery stations do we have to establish in order to provide sufficient energy to everybody? It's relatively simple. If you have a house and a solar energy up there, you can produce your own energy and you can then drive with an electric car. But if you live in a multi-family home there in Vienna, it only gets a bit more complicated. And if you then want to drive outside, it gets complicated. So we have it then. Then the question is battery really the best alternative? What about hydrogen for cars? Well, then you have problems. Okay, maybe I could work out, but then how do we transport energy? Where to produce it? How do we transport it? And etc., etc. So many things emerge there, which we would like to get an understanding now at the national level. Energy production is, or energy is nowadays a widely distributed commodity across the world. We have oil and gas as the most important ones. In the future, there may be different forms of energy transported, different ways how they are produced, different ways how then they are stored. And about these more physical parts of it, would like to learn something. And so we're very thankful to have three specialists here, two on the electronically, one will come physically, that's what we hope. And so let's start with the first speaker, intended before hand over. It's Mr. Timur Gül, who has been head of the Energy Technology Policy Division at the International Energy Agency in Paris since 2018, where he analyzes the current state and prospects of clean energy technology across different energy sectors. And before working at this energy agency, he was a researcher at Scherer Institute in Switzerland for 3 years, and he holds a PhD from ETH Zurich as well as master degree from environmental engineering from Royal Institute of Technology in Stockholm. My welcome to you, thanks a lot. And the second presentation of the second speaker is before it gets invited, and this is done by my colleague here, and I give the floor up to you, and then we'll return for the discussion. Please, you have the floor.
Good afternoon from Paris. Thank you very much for the kind invitation. My name is Timur Gül. I'm the head of the Energy Technology Policy Division here at the IEA, and broadly in charge of all matters that concern new and emerging clean energy technologies across the entire spectrum of energy production and use. So we're not only looking at, say, the power sector, but also at how you produce hydrogen, how do you decarbonize transport, building sector, heavy industries, etc. Just to say, the IEA is an intergovernmental organization. We are advising our membership on energy and climate policy. So this is one of our core preoccupations. Broadly speaking, the IEA family of members covers around 80% of global energy demand. So we are very well placed here, I think, in the global energy discourse. It is a really great pleasure for me to be here with you today at this event of the Österreichische Nationalbank. So thank you very much for the kind invitation, and to Governor Holzmann for the introduction. Very sorry I cannot be with you in person, but it's extremely busy days as always. So what I'd like to do with you today is to walk you through some key considerations as regards the pace of the clean energy transition at a global level, with a view to the possible or not achievement of the 1.5 degrees goal, and then to discuss some of those present day preoccupations that the governor also touched upon in his opening remarks that concern decision makers today around the world, as we are seeing it, as we are experiencing it on a daily level, because they're all preoccupied with the idea of how their economies can effectively participate in and in fact benefit from the new energy economy that is emerging according to our analysis. So I'll now share with you my slides. I hope you can see them well. So let me start by a look at IEA scenarios and what they tell us. Also with a view to their effective interpretation, because there's always one of the experiences that I'm certainly personally making quite frequently is that there's always a lot of confusion around the scenarios. How do we see the future, etc. First key point to keep in mind here is that any of our scenarios should never be considered a forecast. There are generally ways to think through the long-term outlook of the energy sector using an internally consistent set of assumptions. You can generally distinguish here exploratory scenarios on the one hand and normative scenarios on the other hand. Broadly speaking, here at the IEA, we use exploratory scenarios to explore the impact of different levels of policy stringency on the possible future evolution of the energy sector and what this might actually mean for the achievement of government targets such as the 1.5 degrees goal. And then we use normative scenarios to do just the opposite. We are using them to understand what would need to change to achieve a predefined goal such as the 1.5 degree goals. In all this, a key value here of the scenario work that we are doing is that we are updating it every year, so we can track progress very carefully and very granularly in order to understand what has changed year on year in our outlook. And when you look at the current policy settings, our expectations before the Paris Agreement back in 2015 was a world with a strongly rising emissions from energy production, and use the pre-Paris baseline suggested a global mean temperature rise by around 3.5 degrees by the end of this century. But much has happened, of course, ever since the Paris Agreement was agreed and then put into force. Many policies have been adopted, many ambitions have been announced, many technologies have improved. All of this, of course, has impacts on the future growth of energy-related emissions. Our core normative scenario is called the stated policy scenario. Here we track policy and technology progress. In this scenario, we look at all the existing policies and all the policy announcements that have been put in place or announced at the day we are making the analysis. So once a year, we're making a cutoff around September, and we look at all what are the implications for the long-term outlook on the basis just of existing and announced policies. So we don't speculate what governments may or may not be doing in response to failure or not in achieving their own goals. We just look at the implications of what we know from them to see how much they have improved and how far they are still away from reaching their targets. In some ways, we're trying to hold up the mirror to policymakers. And the good news here is, from our most recent up-to-date analysis from last October, is that key technology and policy trends have already shaved off around 1 degree of projected long-term global warming compared to our pre-Paris baseline, thanks to all the policies that have been put in place, thanks to all the announcements that have been made, and thanks to the technology progress that we have seen. This brings us to a long-term expectation of around 2.5 degrees by the end of this century. This is obviously a much better outcome than just a couple of years ago, but still by far not enough to avoid the severe impacts of climate change. Can we reduce the temperature rise by another 1 degree and keep it within the 1.5 degrees limit? That will be, of course, a tough task. But if governments follow through and implement their nationally determined contributions and their net zero pledges that they have made, so European Union by around 2050, US by the 2050, China by 2060, India by 2070, etc., etc. And if companies follow through on their own commitments, which we also by analyzing in great detail, such as in aviation, shipping, and elsewhere, then that takes us a very long way. We recognize that all this, the implementation ask here is quite a big if, and we cannot take for granted that this will be achieved. But in our announced pledges scenario, which is our second normative scenario, we are seeing that on the basis of the announcements that have been made, all those announcements that I've mentioned, we are on track for a global mean temperature rise of 1.7 degrees by the end of the century. But as you can see, the pathway to get emissions down to net zero by 2050 and thereby limiting global warming to 1.5 degrees requires an even faster transition. The IEA's key normative scenario is our net zero by 2050 scenario, which aligns with 1.5 degrees with no low overshoot. We released a roadmap for this net zero by 2050 scenario 2 years ago, almost on the day, in which we laid out exactly how this can be achieved, and we will provide a major update by the end of September this year. In all that, what is important to recognize from all IEA scenarios is that all trends are going the same way. That is a world of an emission peak, a transition to clean energy. The question is not if this will happen, but when, at which pace, and that's what our scenarios help actually informing. By looking at all stated policies every year, we can see where the trend is headed, and the trend is very clear here. Last year, for the first time, we were able to say that already under today's policy settings, with all the policies that are in place and have been announced, they are already strong enough to generate an overall peak in fossil fuel demand before the end of this decade. Fossil fuel use, we are projecting first and foremost a plateau in gas demand, coal demand to peak within the next few years, and oil demand to reach a high point in the mid-2030s before falling back slightly. Fossil fuel use, as you all know, and the emissions from their combustion has risen every decade since the start of the Industrial Revolution more than 200 years ago. But in a nutshell, all of our scenarios now have a growing global economy and growing demand for energy service, but alongside a reduced role for fossil fuels in meeting these needs. From our perspective, and this was the first time that we saw this understated policy settings, that is a pivotal moment in energy history. And we do think that there's more to come as governments around the world put more policies in place each year. The clean energy economy, from our perspective, is actually coming much faster than many think. Let me give you some data points to back up this latter statement about the pace of the global energy transition. So no long-term scenarios, no assumption, etc. Just a view on some of the important trends around the world that we saw last year when it comes to clean energy technology deployment. Solar capacity additions rose by almost 40% last year globally, which is, if you put it next to the power capacity of a country, it's equivalent to Brazil's total power capacity. A further 20% increase is expected actually this year. Nuclear came back strong actually, with capacity additions surging by 40% in 2022. Heat pumps to heat our buildings and homes are outsailing gas boilers in the United States and in parts of Europe. Sales actually grew by 11% last year globally. Electric vehicle sales, they were also mentioned in the introductory remarks, jumped by 55% last year. By the end of this year, and this is also our latest analysis, they are set to represent 1 in every 5 vehicles sold from just 1 in every 25 3 years ago in 2020. Electrolyzer capacity for hydrogen more than doubled over the last 2 years, and energy efficiency improved at 2%, twice the rate of previous years, although this is of course much less than what is actually needed to be on track with 1.5 degrees. In our latest analysis that I cannot put on the screen, unfortunately, today, because it was just released today, and so it's not on this picture yet. It shows a significant change that is going on in energy spending, actually, in investment side of things. 5 years ago, for each $1 invested in fossil fuels, the same went into clean energy. So $1 invested in fossil fuels, $1 invested in clean energy. This year, for each $1 invested in fossil fuels, we're expecting $1.7 to be going to clean energy. And the shining example here of this growth in clean energy investment is actually solar PV, which in 2023 is set to attract more capital than global oil production for the first time ever in energy history. Now, with all that recognition of that pace of the clean energy transition, what is important to recognize is that towards 2030, much more still has to be done. Clean energy transition require a huge expansion of technology supply, and the good news here is that a lot of that expansion is already underway. We released a report in early January called Energy Technology Perspectives, where we analyzed supply chains for several clean energy technologies, technology by technology, region by region, supply chain step by supply chain step, and we provided an update just last week for the G7 Leaders Summit on the request of G7 leaders. And what we've seen is actually a strong, very, very strong growth in project announcements across several of the key technologies. Electrolyzers are the technology of the day. There is a huge rush to building manufacturing operations in many countries. Just 3 years ago, when we released a study called The Future of Hydrogen for the Japanese G20 presidency, the global manufacturing capacity for electrolyzers was less than 3 gigawatt per year. By end of last year, it has reached 10 gigawatts per year, which is a big increase for such a nascent industry. And the outlook here is very bright. On current announcements, manufacturing capacity for electrolyzers could exceed 100 gigawatts per year by the year 2030, which is half of the level required to be on track for net zero emissions by 2050. A significant gap, of course, and not all of these announced manufacturing projects might see the light of the day, but the market is extremely dynamic. It takes only 1 to 3 years on average to bring manufacturing facilities online, so the project pipeline can actually expand further and very rapidly. There's more good news when you look at EV batteries for electric cars, where existing manufacturing capacity is already high compared with today's demand, but where the announced capacity is actually at the level required to be on track for net zero emissions by 2030 within the next couple of years. A scenario, just to give you a sense here, in which global sales of electric cars reach 60% of total car sales by 2030, up from 14% last year. Again, not all these manufacturing projects might see the light of the day, but from the perspective of battery manufacturing, a transition to electric cars at a scale that is compatible with 1.5 degrees appears increasingly possible. And finally, for solar PV, the manufacturing capacity by 2030, as it has been announced so far, is actually set to be much larger than what is required for being on track for net zero emissions by 2050, if all the projects announced get actually built. So with this in mind, the focus of policymakers, and I'm now coming a bit to questions also of trade and that have already been mentioned before as part of the introductory remarks. There's the policy focus that we are seeing with governments around the world is increasingly shifting to not to questions of will the energy transition happen, but how well are we positioned as a country to participate in this new energy economy that is emerging, or how resilient and secure is our own access to each step of the technology, clean energy technology supply chain. And that's an analysis that we also carried out at a significant level of detail in our recent report. Why is that question of supply chains important? What we find is that supply chains today for clean energy technologies are heavily geographically concentrated. This is of concern, of course, because concentration at any point and along any supply chain is a risk because it makes the entire supply chain vulnerable to incidents, whether they're related to natural disasters, to technical failures, to an individual country's policy choice, or to a company's decision. In the case of clean energy technologies, the discussion around such concentration risks often focuses on the mining sector, and there's a lot of good reason for doing so. If you look at the top 3 producer countries, they account for around 80% of global production in the case of cobalt, 90% for lithium, and around 45% for copper. But it's very important to recognize that concentration is not limited to mining. As we move further downstream in supply chains, we see a high degree of concentration there as well. Minerals must be processed and refined before they become materials that can be used. Such activity today shows a very similar level of geographical concentration as mining. Bulk materials, such as aluminum and steel, are very important for clean energy technology supply chains. They are used to produce electric cars, wind turbines, etc. So these materials are produced at scales that are orders of magnitude larger than critical minerals, and they are mature markets, of course. But here we see still a significant level of concentration among the top 3 producer countries as well. But what is really important is the concentration of new and emerging clean energy technologies. There we see a very, very consistently high degree of geographical concentration of around 80%, at least, depending on the technology that you're looking at, being held by the top 3 producer countries for batteries, for onshore wind, for solar PV, for heat pumps, and for electrolyzers. And when you look at the single largest producer country, then China plays an outsized role virtually everywhere, with the one exception here being the mining step, where resource endowment is the critical factor and not a policy effort that determines the place in the supply chain step. But for any other supply chain step, China is the largest producer country today and is likely to remain so for years to come. For some of the key components of solar PV and battery supply chains, for example, China already today has significantly excess capacity that operates at very low utilization rates already today. Now, our analysis suggests that the combined market opportunity for mass manufactured technologies, such as solar PV, such as EV batteries, such as wind, etc., is around $790 billion based on current announcements, more than 4 times above today's levels, if governments continue to implement on time and in full their climate pledges. In terms of relative positioning, the pipeline of manufacturing projects suggests that China is far and away best placed to tap into this market opportunity. China accounts for most of the current announced manufacturing capacity plans to 2030 for solar PV components, for onshore wind components, and for EV battery components. Hydrogen electrolyzers are really the one main exception, with China and the European Union each holding around a quarter of announced manufacturing capacity for 2030. And you see here that this market is extremely dynamic. The project announcements have really taken up in pace. We made an analysis where we cut off our analysis by the end of November, released the report in January, and then that's the light blue graph, and then we looked at it again just a couple of weeks ago as an input into the G7 Leaders Summit, and you see the dark blue is the pace at which announcements have picked up around the world. What is critically important here to recognize is that China is unlikely to absorb all its potential production domestically. When you look at the expected demand for these technologies in each country, as it is required for them to meet their own climate pledges, then it is clear that China is well positioned not only to be, it is already the main largest global supplier for clean energy technology trade, but is also set to remain that leading global exporter of clean energy technologies through 2030 if all of the announced projects materialize. There are a couple of caveats here, of course. First one is that only a small part of the announced manufacturing projects can be considered committed. So not all of them have, or only a fraction of them have actually started construction or are about to begin construction imminently. And the second point is, of course, that policy matters. Many of the decisions by investors and project developers will be influenced by the policy landscape, and several countries are now tailoring, in some cases reinventing their industrial strategies, which will have profound impacts. Think of the US Inflation Reduction Act, think about the Net Zero Industry Act in Europe as part of the Fit for 55 package, Repower EU plan, etc. There's Japan's Green Transformation Program. There's the Production-Linked Incentive Scheme in India, and of course, China's clean energy expansion plans. The last point that I would like to make is about the competitiveness of existing and new industries is a key concern for policymakers around the world, and it requires obviously a very careful look at relative strengths for an effective participation in the new energy economy that is emerging. Here, access to low-cost energy is a competitive advantage, of course, and it can lead to lower production costs for energy and commodities. This is not a point that is going to be fully disappearing with a clean energy economy. If you look at hydrogen as an example, virtually all of the hydrogen that is produced today is made from natural gas and coal, typically at a cost of around $1 to $3 per kilogram. Hydrogen is now increasingly produced at commercial scale using electrolyzers, but such hydrogen tends to be much more expensive, even though these production costs obviously will plummet to 2030 from the falling cost of renewables, from falling cost of electrolyzers, as well as hydrogen storage. And our view is that hydrogen could become, that is produced from electrolyzers, could then become competitive with conventional routes in areas with low-cost renewable electricity, even without subsidy. But just as oil and natural gas cost less to produce in some countries than in others, there will be significant variations in hydrogen production cost, mainly because of the underlying differences in the cost of renewable electricity. You see here an overview of different countries and regions, and the important part here is that this, of course, has knock-on effects on the cost of the industrial commodities that could be produced using this hydrogen, such as primary steel production. Europe here is currently at the forefront of efforts to develop and deploy innovative processes for producing steel with dramatically lower CO2 emissions. And so in the medium term, Europe and other higher cost regions at the innovation frontier will be able to maintain a competitive position if products in the market are differentiated according to their emission footprints. But in the longer term, more countries will be able to compete in the market for near zero emission commodities, and then cost will again be a critical factor. Commodities like steel are, of course, traded in fiercely competitive international markets. Of course, and that as a final remark, perhaps, production cost is not the only determinant of competitiveness. The size of the domestic market, the skills of the workforce, potential synergies and spillovers between existing and new industries are all critical factors, but countries will, of course, need to strategically and carefully consider where to specialize domestically and where and when establishing partnerships or making direct investment in third countries is a viable option. I'd leave it here, and thank you very much for your attention. Looking forward to the discussion later on. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Gill, for this overview and shed a large portion of optimism about progress made. The last part was a bit less from a European perspective, because given this cost for green hydrogen, looks like that Donawitz-Kapfenberg would have to move outside. And I mention this because Professor Kimberger arrived here, and he is professor in this region there. So we'll see whether he contradicts this. Is optimistic where steel production is be able to take place in Europe. Let me continue now with the second person on the electronic other side, Mr. Stefan Allegath, who is Senior Climate Change Advisor of the World Bank Climate Change Group, and he joined the World Group in 2012 after 10 years of academic research, and they worked on the diverse areas of greening energy. They worked in economics, natural disaster and risk management, climate change adaptation, urban policy and economics, and climate change mitigation and green growth. And he holds a degree of engineering from École Polytechnique, the PhD of economics from the École des Hautes Études de Sciences Sociales. Both Barrys, welcome. And I hand over to you and for the 20 minutes on your presentation inputs. Please, Mr. Allegath, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, and it's a pleasure to be with you, even if it's remotely. Thanks very much for your interest on those topics, and I think it's great to see your institutions looking into these issues. When we look at the numbers we're talking about, this transition is certainly macro critical. So it's important that people in charge of managing the macroeconomic framework of countries have a look at those issues and take it into account, even if it's not the core of your mandate. Just a few words on my role. I'm with the World Bank Group, and most of what I'm doing these days is to coordinate a new diagnostic that we have started to do in all of the countries where we are active, which we call the country climate and development reports. And really the idea of those reports is that we're moving from a world where the World Bank was doing development, and then we were doing a little bit of climate on the side. But very clearly, this is not working anymore. We wanted to move to a situation where countries have resilient and low carbon development pathways that we could support with everything we have. So this framing with two buckets doesn't work, and we really want to have a more integrated strategy. And when we started to do that, what was missing in many countries is an idea of what is this resilient low carbon pathway. And we decided for all of the countries to do this analysis to understand what it means. And I want to say our work here is not about climate so much. Our work is very much about development, about economic growth, about poverty reduction, about job creation. Our question is, how can countries meet and reach their development objectives, even though there are climate change impacts, even though the world is decarbonizing, and even though countries have their own commitments to reduce emissions? But the end goal is always the development objective. So in a sense, I think we're sharing a little bit the same challenge, that climate is not a core mandate. Our core mandate is development, like your mandate is financial stability and economic stability. But more and more climate becomes part of our mandate just because of the importance of the agenda. So I will just show you a few slide on the on our reports and the main lessons that we draw from them. I hope you can see my screen now. So this, yes, you can. Okay, good, excellent. So in the first year of our reports, we published reports covering 25 countries. They are the ones in blue here. They cover about 35% of global emissions, and it goes from Malawi to China. So very different contexts, of course, across those countries. And I will not discuss all of what we see in those reports. I want to discuss what you opened with, which is these scenarios reducing emissions in the world. And what you see on the screen now are the emissions in the countries where we're doing those low carbon development scenarios. And I want to stress that in upper middle income countries, like China, Turkey, Argentina, Brazil, all scenarios are going to net zero in 2050 or soon after, 2060 or 2065. In lower middle income countries and low income countries like the Bangladesh and Ghana and Pakistan, all scenarios are not going to net zero in 2050. So I want to stress, and I really enjoyed Timur's presentation. I just want to stress the difference in our scenarios. Here we don't have a global net zero scenario. We have a scenario that reduces emissions by 70% only, and it makes a difference. So I just wanted to put that on the table. The good news, and I wanted to answer to your opening remarks. The good news is that we know how to get to net zero emissions. So there are technological uncertainties, as you mentioned it, but the big picture in all countries are about the same, right? The first priority is to decarbonize electricity with solar, wind, and I'll get back to how do we do this fully. We have to shift the fuels we use in electricity, in transport, heating, and industries, going from fossil fuels to most of the time electricity, and in some other cases, other fuels like green hydrogen or ammonia. Third pillar is we can't do this without a lot of efforts to reduce energy demand. So energy efficiency will really play a key role. And of course, one part which is really, really important, it's the preservation and even the increase of natural carbon sinks. So we have to stop deforestation, and we have to reverse deforestation to even have like afforestation, so that we use land to capture CO2 from the atmosphere, and we generate negative emissions from land so that we can compensate for the positive emissions that are really difficult to avoid. And maybe air travel, for instance, being one of those. In all of our countries, you find those 4 pillars with different sequencing, different magnitude of effort at different point in time. But in all of the countries, you need those 4 pillars to be there. One of the really important one, and the first one, and the key priority for the next decade, is electricity generation. And here, and sorry, we have a lot of countries, so there's a lot on the slides, but let me describe what you're saying to you. One thing that's, I think, was striking for many of our teams who were not working on climate before, was that even if you don't care about climate change and emissions, if you want to meet electricity demand today, what you're doing today is mostly renewable energy. It's mostly solar and wind. And that the dotted lines you see in all of these countries, the dotted lines are scenarios if you don't have any climate objective. It's the least cost way of meeting electricity demand. And what you see is renewable energy is increasing extremely rapidly. The blue lines is for our low carbon development strategies. And in those cases, you do even more renewable. But when we talk to policymakers, one thing that we want them to understand is we're not doing solar and wind only because we care about the climate. We're doing solar and winds because today it's just the cheapest way of doing it. And we see a lot of countries, and let me use the example of Turkey or maybe Vietnam, countries that are still investing in coal power plants, even though if you look only at the costs, this is more expensive than alternatives. And why are they doing that? They are doing that for mostly political economy reasons, and also because of institutional reasons, the way they are organized to invest in energy and the way their energy market is being regulated. So climate or no climate, we have a huge economic gain to capture if we help countries scale up their investments in renewables. In parallel, we see a drop in coal. And again, that drop in coal is not because we care about climate. This drop in coal is because coal is not a good technology. It's expensive. It's polluting. It creates air pollution that has a major health consequences. So again, we're trying to explain to policymakers that even in scenarios where they don't care about the climate, probably their coal power plants are going to close and not being replaced. Probably their coal mines will have to close. So the transition out of coal is something that is happening. And that's the key question is, how can we get organized to get this scaled down smoothest for the communities and the workers, but also well organized from an energy perspective so that we don't have the type of outages that we saw in China a couple of years ago, because the closing of coal was fully coordinated and not well coordinated with the growth in renewables. So there is a challenge in getting out of coal without threatening security of electricity for the economy, something we see in South Africa very sadly these days. What we see in our scenarios, if you want to decarbonize, you have a few new technologies entering. And I think that's a little bit what you focused on during your opening remarks. What you see here is the amount of batteries that we have in our systems if you want to decarbonize. So clearly, you have a change in the type of technologies. It's not only solar and winds. What happens to batteries and storage is absolutely critical. And there is a challenge when you look at the amount of batteries, and I think Timur put that point very well. if you look at the demands for batteries, there is a challenge in meeting that demand. We see very positive news in terms of announcements of battery productions, but we also know that supply chain bottlenecks can happen unexpectedly. And so we have to be very, very careful of how we scale up the production of batteries. And of course, the question of where the minerals come from and how those minerals are being produced. There might be some very harsh environmental and social consequences if you see how some of those materials are being extracted today. So there is a challenge to make this transition a good transition to help countries with those resources to produce them in the right way, including with the right environmental and social considerations. So this is the summary for all of our reports. And you see, so this is for the capacity of the power system. You see two things. If we want to decarbonize, we need a much bigger power system. And I'll come back on the investment side in a minute, but investments in the power sector will need to increase quite a lot. And second, the investment is mostly in renewables. Here you see basically a decline or a stabilization for fossil fuels. You see nuclear energy playing a small role that's not increasing too much. So this remains very marginal in our scenarios, and that's because of the cost of nuclear energy, which is just more expensive than alternatives. So it's a pure economic decision here not to have more nuclear in those scenarios. Where we have uncertainty playing a key role is for the last tons. So basically, for us, working on developing countries, between now and 2035, it's relatively a consensus, right? You have to boost renewable energy, you have to improve your grids, and you have to invest in storage. When you get to fully decarbonizing your grid, then you get to the hard things. And here it's very different depending on countries, and there are also some substitutes, right? So where you have a lot of hydropower, this is clearly the way to go. And in our report on Brazil, for instance, Brazil doesn't need a lot of efforts to decarbonize the grid because they have so much hydropower that they can use hydropower as a basically giant battery. In countries where you don't have that, and that's the case of a lot of Europe, you have a choice between, and it's a choice, but we will probably use all of that in a portfolio approach in different ways. One is green hydrogen, which you need anyway for cement and steel and fertilizers. There is carbon capture and storage, which you also probably need for process emissions, for instance, in cement. There is nuclear energy, and we can discuss more about this if you're interested. And you can also keep your fossil fuel plants, but not using them 99.5% of the time, but you just use them in backup if you face a particularly difficult sequence of a few days without wind and solar, for instance. What's really important is in most of our countries, the uncertainty on what share of those different technologies we mobilize to fully decarbonize don't affect the short-term priorities. So we're trying to reassure policymakers that this uncertainty is real, but in most of the case, it doesn't affect short-term priorities. I think there is another question, which is what type of R&D/industrial policies we're doing to support those technologies. But that, of course, not all countries that will be doing that. I just wanted to stress that once you have the zero emission power, then this is the key to decarbonize the rest, right? And I illustrate that with this figure. You see the emission per unit of GDP in the BRICS. You see Brazil at the very bottom. The reason why Brazil is at the very bottom is because they are using so much hydropower. So once your electricity is decarbonized, everything becomes much, much easier. It works for a lot of things except a few heavy industries, fertilizers, cement, steel, where you need more than electricity, and this is where green hydrogen comes in play. And what you see in this figure is a scenario we do for Brazil, showing what they can do with green hydrogen. And basically what you have is transportation, industry shifting from fossil fuels to green hydrogen, which means that you need a much, much bigger power system. You need much, much more electricity to create that green hydrogen. So the shift of industries and transport to hydrogen means that you have a bigger challenge in terms of investment in the power sector. But the cost for the economy as a whole is not changed too much. So you have to invest much more in the power system, but all of your sectors will make big savings because using more electricity and green hydrogen is a saving for them. In all of our scenarios, export of hydrogen is very small. Hydrogen is extremely difficult to transport. You can transport it in the form of ammonia for fertilizers, but mostly we imagine this to be exported in the form of steel or aluminum. So basically you use green hydrogen to produce other things, and that the other things that are being exported. But we don't really see like a huge trade of hydrogen, a little bit for ammonia. But I think in our scenarios, what we have mostly is countries using their green potential to produce goods and then exporting those goods. This figure is very complicated. Don't try to read it. I just wanted to make one point with this figure, is that I think Timur showed you the green value chain for like electric vehicles and batteries and solar panels and so on. One thing we're doing is we're looking at the potential of countries to grow exports in green value chain. But if you take the case of Brazil, we don't expect Brazil to export a lot of solar panels or like windmills. But in the upstream value chain, Brazil has a lot of strength that they can capture. Here you see for wind what they are currently doing on the left and what they could do on the right. So I think a lot of countries today can enter this market, create jobs, increase their exports, and help us diversify the supply chain for green value chain so that we're less dependent on a few countries, and especially dependency on China, which is really, really large at the moment. So we're trying to also show countries all of the opportunities that they have. Since you're a central bank, I cannot not mention the implications for economic growth. I could talk about this for hours, but basically the short story is we're connecting our scenarios to mostly CG modeling and to look at the impact on economic growth. And what you see in the upper layer of this figure is that we expect this transition to accelerate economic growth. So there is no compromise between economic growth and decarbonization in our scenarios. What you see in the bottom is a compromise with consumption, because our scenarios have more economic growth, but they have also a lot more investments, which means that the challenge for countries is to increase the investment rate in their economy, at least over the next 20 years. And that, of course, is a macroeconomic challenge. And of course, you need to protect the poorest and the most vulnerable. So I want to finish with just a last slide on the investment required. So what you see here is the additional investments needed for the transition for countries at different income level. For the upper middle income countries, so Argentina, Turkey, China, Kazakhstan, it's relatively small. We're talking about 1-2% of GDP of increase in investment. If you're looking at lower middle income countries, it starts to increase, and you have a big range going up to 5-6% in countries like Peru or Vietnam. And if you look at the poorest countries, you get 8, 10, 11%. And I should say this is not only the energy transition, right? This is also resilience and adaptation. But the point we're making from the World Bank Group perspective is for countries like Turkey and China, this is mostly reallocation of their investments. You do less coal and more solar, to use a caricature. If you're in the Sahel, in Cameroon, or in Pakistan, it's not a reallocation. You need much more investments. And so from a global perspective, the challenge we face is how do we help those countries manage this increase in investment, because they cannot do it alone. And to do it, they will need support from the international community with more access to capital, more role of the private sector, but also grants. They will also need transfers, concessional resources. Otherwise, we won't manage to make this transition. So I'll stop here, but I really wanted to finish on the investment challenge, because that's something that will play a key role at the international level, and where we really need a concerted approach. Thank you so much, and I'm happy to take any questions.
Thank you very much. Merci beaucoup. Alikat, it was highly interesting to see how you refer the energy transition with the economic development in the emerging and developing world, and where the challenges are. Believe me that the question of investment, of financing it, is high on our agenda for different reasons, and it would cover too much of the space if I would go into the details. To explain it to you at a different moment, we can share a paper on this one. Thanks a lot. Very, very interesting. Let me move over now to the last presenter, with whom I've already had the pleasure to have a one-on-one on energy. Who's here now for a larger audience is Professor Thomas Kinberger, who is professor and chair of the Institute of Energy Networks at the Montana University Leoben since 2004. The reason I mentioned the name before, I was born in this city, so I have a special link to Leoben. He's expert for integrated energy systems in public space and industry, and the main aspects of his research and teaching is also interdisciplinary systemic approaches of renewable integration and increasing overall systemic energy efficiency. So thanks again here, Professor Kinberger. The floor is yours.
Governor Holzmann, thank you very much for the introduction. Ladies and gentlemen, thanks for having me. I just want to speak about Europe a little bit. We have already heard a lot from the other speakers, which makes it kind of hard for me to top up, but I will do my very best. Probably some aspects which are probably a little bit different here in the study I want to present. So climate pledges, we all know that we have plenty of them, that we want to become climate neutral. Here in Europe, some states like we in Austria, we want to even be a little faster in that regard. And as we have already heard, this can help us, or this may help us in terms of policy exports, in terms of sustaining our industry, which is highly export orientated. But for that, we need to have a quite good research, technology and innovation policy. Industrial policies are important in that regard. We all know that we are lagging behind when it comes to our emission pathways. We already reduce our emissions in Europe, as you know, but not fast enough. What's the reason of emission reduction nowadays? This is the expansion of renewable energies and not energy efficiency. This can be clearly said when one looks at the primary energy consumption, which is in sideways movement in Europe. Does not go back, it just compensates for economic growth. This is the first conclusion from my side, a quite obvious one. Both must go faster and more comprehensive. RES expansion and energy efficiency. Next point I want to stress out is potentials on renewable energies. This slide is probably a little bit small here, but when you look at it in detail, then you see that there is a very, very small cycle which shows the potentials, the renewable energy potentials in Europe, which leads to the fact that our degree of self-sufficiency in terms of renewable is much smaller compared to other world regions. In the global south, as you can see, there is all those black areas compared to the very, very light gray ones in Europe, in China, in Europe and in China. This is where there is not so much potentials. Here in Europe, we have other issues, low acceptance. So not really when it comes to the exploitation of renewables, but when it comes to energy infrastructures, for instance. yeah, this leads me to a second hypothesis. Europe will need renewable imports in future to become climate neutral. So let's look on Europe a little bit more in detail. Here you see the European countries again. It's astonishing that Europe is not dominated by solar power. This is what we face as Austrians, where there is a lot of solar power potential. But when you look on that on a European perspective, then you see that there is wind power actually much more dominating. Same picture here also in Europe. A lot of big European countries do not have sufficient potentials in order to supply their own consumption with renewables. This is in the center of Europe the case. Other countries like Norway, for instance, or Spain, they have a lot of renewable potentials, which leads to some inter-European energy transfer in future. Some numbers probably. In Europe, there is a gross domestic energy consumption of around 15,000 terawatt hours per year. You see 15,400, the 400, this is us in Austria. Just to see it in a perspective. The potentials is around 50,000 terawatt hours. And normally there is a certain ratio between technical potentials and exploitable potentials, so that a third or a fifth of it can be exploited. There is actually no comprehensive studies on that on European level. The gold standard that we have is the EU reference scenario, and this speaks from about 6,400 terawatt hours of renewables to come from Europe. So when you compare this with the gross domestic consumption, one can see, okay, this is not enough. So this scenario is for 2050, one has to say. Let's come with this to another topic, which is the growth rate of renewables. And we have learned on that a lot. This is, I would say, underestimated in a global scale. So we all know this projections from the International Energy Agency, where experts were consulted and asked how the trend is on the development of renewables, and they say, okay, in the next years this will look like this, and then the next year comes and boom, it is much more than they have expected. So this is quite interesting. In Europe, we see this trend as well, as we have already seen. But, and this is the big but, the development of grids, so the infrastructural development, which must always be related to this point of renewable expansion, this is lacking behind. So we face tremendous needs for grids to be built in the future. So this is electricity, wind and PV. And then there is the other big elephant in the room, which is hydrogen and or derivatives from hydrogen. And there is a cost down potential in the development of hydrogen production. Timo spoke on that. It is a question when there is cost break-even point related to natural gas, but it is about to come. So no one really knows when this is the case. We have done a study on this. There is quite some studies out there, where there is a quite big price decrease in hydrogen to be foreseen. Natural gas. So I have learned from media today that we have some 26 euros per megawatt hour by today, which is the niveau that we had some 2 years ago before the Ukraine crisis. But there is the EU emission trading framework, which adds CO2 costs on it, so that we will have some costs of natural gas, which will increase in the future, leading to leading to cost parity to hydrogen somewhere in the 2030s, the 2040s. Important is that that even though that hydrogen will get cheaper and cheaper and cost competent with natural gas, electricity will be cheaper, of course. So the point is, or you can electrify, the cheaper it is, and the less hydrogen you need, the better it is. And a big lever for that is energy efficiency, of course. And this was our motivation to run a scenario where we have taken the European energy services on the one hand side, and on the other hand side, this 6,400 terawatt hours of exploitable potentials. And in these scenarios, we have had a look to bring this together as good as possible. And our target function was to maximize energy efficiency. And this, as you can see, we have done time resolved in a quite huge optimization model. And when you look here, when you look here on the upper left side, hopefully we can see this good enough, is that the production side is surprisingly balanced. So we all speak in Europe about the need of seasonal storages, and we were completely astonished when you look purely on the profiles that wind and solar power, that they balance out pretty well. The point is to get this picture, you need super huge grids. That is the point. So this is one takeaway message. The other takeaway message is when you look on the final energy demand, one can see that a lot of applications are electrified here. So battery electric vehicles are more efficient compared to e-fuel powered vehicles. There is a lot of electrification in industry, which is much more efficient than do it with gas-based energy carriers or with derivatives. There is heat pumps for the supply of space heat, but also process heat. What else do we see? We see the use of waste heat. So we have plenty of waste heat in Europe coming out of our industrial facilities to be used. The point is that this electrification leads to electricity needs, which cannot be covered by this exploitation rate of renewables we have taken into account. So we need to have thermal power plants running to supply the delta. And these power plants, of course, they run on, this is my next point, they run on gaseous fuels. They run on hydrogen to be imported. Yeah, there is other demands for hydrogen or hydrogen derivatives, which we have seen here in that study. And this is exactly what also Stefan said. This is steel industry, this is chemical industry, where we do not have any other alternatives. Here we need hydrogen as feedstock. We cannot electrify it. It's not possible. Then there is aviation, there is maritime, where there is also a need for those gaseous fuels or derivatives from them. And there is then the question with some kind of high temperature application where it is not so sure if it's better to electrify it or to do it with fuel-based units. Yes, and there is also heavy-duty trucks where there it is not so clear. Yeah. And of course, as I said before, there is of course the need to fuel those thermal plants, which are needed to produce electricity. And the point is, the more electricity we can directly exploit here in Europe, the less gas we need for those units. This is a little bit the question, I would say, of acceptance. How much can we achieve here in Europe? Question is where there is really the end of renewable exploitation. This leads me to my conclusions. this scenario I have presented very briefly is a greenfield approach. So we will never have a fully energy maximized system, probably never. But we can identify no-regret measures out of such scenarios, and I'm gonna try the best what I can, yeah, to draw out of it. When one looks on the final energy side, I have to say this all electric fantasies, they cannot be, they does not make any sense. So there will be a need in future for gas derivatives, but those gas derivatives, they will be more expensive than direct electrification, since the price of hydrogen or derivative is always higher than electricity. We can, yeah, electricity to be produced here in Europe locally. The need for those derivatives will be as feedstocks for some high temperature application for long haul transport. Yeah. So since all electric does not make sense, this fully technology open status quo thinking does also not make sense. Yeah. As I mentioned, the more hydrogen or hydrogen derivatives we need, the more we have to buy of that. This will be expensive. Yeah, this is at least the knowledge that we've gained from a lot of literature survey in that regard. The energy sector, yeah, the more renewables are exploited, the lower the gas or gas derivative demand is in thermal power plants, and the higher is the European electrolysis capacity, since this goes, of course, hand in hand. The more renewables are exploited, the more so-called negative residual loads we have, so surpluses of electricity to be used for the operation of electrolysis. Yeah. I would say without any imports of climate neutral hydrogen or hydrogen derivatives, we have a problem here in Europe, since there is this restriction in areas and yeah, a restriction therefore in renewable capacities. Some recommendations for action at last. So expansion of our European renewable potentials as quickly and as comprehensively as possible. We need the support for efficient technologies, heat pumps, not only in buildings, but also in industry, battery electric vehicles, all those key technologies we have already heard about, as quickly and as comprehensively as possible. And this is a quite a new topic. We have to have a look on our transmission systems. We have to expand electricity transmission lines. We have to expand also hydrogen transmission lines in order to get a proper balancing of wind and solar. So we have seen it from the pure profiles that they fit together pretty well, but in order to gain benefits out of that, we have to have those grids. And this is something we can start by today. So there is no hurdle actually to do so. When it comes a little bit on some like future topics, some recommendations from our side, we have to identify, or we should identify research in hydrogen production from renewables. We should intensify research on heat pumps and technologies for climate neutrality in industry. By that, and for that I have stolen a picture from the International Energy Agency. When you look on PV, so China. When you look on wind, see a lot from China. When you look on batteries, there is a lot coming from China. But when you look on the other technologies like hydrogen, like heat pumps, here I would say Europe is quite in a good position, and here we have the chance yeah, to stay in a good role as a technology provider, as a worldwide technology provider. And another key technology, which is never mentioned, is also to be, or may also come from Europe. This is all this technology for climate neutrality in industry, metallurgical processes, carbon capture and utilization, recycling technology, you name it. So we are never talking about this. We are always speaking about PV and hydrogen and electric cars. But there is this big sector of industry we should also focus on. And here, I would say this is also a big chance for Austria. We have quite some history. Here are the huge companies to be able to develop such technologies. Yeah, and this brings me to my last statement again. Without the import of renewables in the form of gases or derivatives, we will come into a problematic situation in terms of climate neutrality. Hopefully, I was not too long. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Mr. Kienberger, for also your very important input there. We have now had 3 different complementary, but also somewhat, how to say, sometimes tension-creating presentations, and we would need now 2 days to go over them. We only have 12 minutes time to deal with it. So I try to give 2 or 3 what I think out, and Mr. Breitenfeller is originally in charge of it, but I took over, sorry for that, can add because you also had the main list. What you all 3 said has a lot of complementarity there, in particular if it has concerns now what you finished with, that yes, we can produce a lot of energy here, but still we have some gaps, so we need to do it from the outside. But even to use our internal one, the number of things like grids and other things we really have to look at. But when it comes then done from the production which can happen, let's say in the global south, the question is how we get it there. What would be the most important mechanism to get hydrogen to Europe, get electricity to Europe in a way which makes sense? And with regards to the development part of it, my question there would be, my understanding is we have problems with the electricity grid in Europe, but Mr. Ali, when you look at, let's say, Africa, how high are the opportunities that in reasonable time you will have an electric grid there? So will it be more than, others say, self-standing mechanisms there in which others electricity is produced, or do they also have for an opportunity, what we like seem to have for wind and solar energy somewhat balance out, not geographically, but on European aggregate, but we have to get the electricity on both sides. And these are only 2 of the many things. We of course take account of what has been said about investment needs and financing. This is part of it. But before we hand over to a quick reaction from your side, what we heard from each other, Mr. Breitenfeller, you want to add something from what you have seen as questions of consistency, confirmation, but also, how to say, contradictions?
I think you have asked the main question, I think, which is also a kind of elephant in the room. But if I may add something which, of course, is linked to it, is also the readiness of, I mean, if we talk in Europe here about the need to import energy from the global south, so that is one thing. But does the global south know that we are talking about it? Yeah, and does it prepare for this? Is it ready to export, or is it rather concerned with providing energy for its own population, which is also increasing and with increasing need for electricity in particular? I mean, I could talk, for example, about this Desert Tech initiative, which I've recently learned is not dead, as I've believed before. It was created in 2009, and it's now in Dubai, I guess, or in Abu Dhabi or somewhere. And there is a lot of countries which are now in some way interlinked in this initiative. But and there's a lot of projects, but all of them compared with the needs, rather smaller projects. For instance, Namibia providing ammonia, for example, for Germany. There is a cooperation project. A similar project is in the making, or at least in the discussion, between Tunisia and Austria, via going directly via a hydrogen pipeline, as I understand at least. So projects like this are discussed, are in the making, but is it already something that is really a big debate, for example, in Africa or other regions in the world, or is it something that is only perceived from our own Eurocentric perspective as something important? And this is particularly, of course, a question to you, Mr. Aligat, but perhaps to all others. I know that, Timo, you have to leave us very early, so perhaps you might start with some observations on the contributions of others, and in particular on answering the questions of the governor.
Yeah, thank you very much. Yeah, maybe a bit broader in some ways. I think there's a lot of consistency in what we're saying. No, I think one of the key takeaways I think that everyone appears to be sharing is that you don't have that one technology, one type of approach to everything. I mean, as it was pointed out, you need different technology options. I mean, electricity can get you a long way, but not in every sector, etc. Certain openness to technologies such as carbon capture, utilization, and storage, etc., can really help bringing forward decarbonization, depending on the sector, depending on the industrial structure in every single country. There are many big ifs here, of course. No? I mean, is the industry going to stay in a country that is a high-price environment, doesn't have access to cheap resources, etc., is another question that changes the overall picture, to which extent you may or may not be relying on imports of new fuels, new energy carriers, if you like. Maybe otherwise, just to say, I think what is very important to keep in mind is the dynamics here. No, I mean, for certain things, we have a good degree of confidence. The power sector has been mentioned, the access to cheap renewables, falling costs, etc. We have a good degree of confidence really about electric cars, I would say. There are many issues, of course, in the supply chain and building up a recharging infrastructure, etc. Do we have access on time and in full to critical minerals that would be required? What can we do on the innovation side of things with the battery in order to reduce demand? But I think the technology trend is very visible and very clear on other elements. Maybe on the competitive positions also. One of our slides was here shown by Professor Kienberger from our recent study from last week. I think the position that Europe has in terms of manufacturing on different technologies is not necessarily locked in this way. No, for solar PV, it is going to be very, very difficult to compete with China just by sheer scale in terms of the sheer amount of manufacturing capacity that is already in place and is underway. But one of the reasons why the geographical concentration in that project pipeline for wind is fairly stable to 2030 is because there are hardly any project announcements. So, and this is not only true in Europe, but also in China, etc. So Europe has a way here, and I would not underestimate that way if I was a European policymaker, both in onshore wind and in offshore wind production. By contrast, in heat pumps, for example, the outsized role that we are seeing to 2030 in the project announcements is actually coming from the fact that European industries are happy to announce. That is not necessarily the case in the United States or in China when it comes to heat pump manufacturing. So there are a couple of complications here, etc. But it is important to keep in mind the competitive position of Europe will be really determined by a large number of factors. And maybe just a closing remark here on hydrogen trade, ammonia trade, etc. We are trading ammonia today. I mean, this is not a new thing. We know how to do it in the context of the fertilizer industry. And when I think about the recent trade agreements between Namibia and Germany, this is may not be ammonia that you directly need for decarbonization of for future uses in different sectors or for regasification, etc., but maybe to replace existing domestic ammonia production. The liquefied hydrogen story in terms of trade, the technical challenges have been mentioned here. I would just add in terms of number of projects that exist. We have one demonstration project in the world for an export-import type of trade. So we are quite some way. We have quite some way to go here, and the debate around repurposing existing LNG terminals, etc., that is technically not as obvious as it is sometimes postulated. So I would be careful to put all my eggs in one basket. But for the technologies that we have, I would not see what would hinder us from rolling them out. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Timur. And Stefan, would you like to?
Yeah, I think you're really asking the right questions, and I want to start with your questions about the needs, the energy exports in developing countries, and the answer is yes. Those countries see the opportunity. You mentioned Namibia, but we have similar things in Mauritania. We have things in the Gulf. We have things in Brazil. Even in places that do not have enough electricity and energy for their own population. And in the case of Namibia, I think that the plan for exports is something like 4 times the domestic energy demand. So here, I think that a couple of things which are really important is first, if we don't make sure that the populations benefit from those projects, if it's only exports to Europe, I don't think this is going to work. This will backfire at one point because you can't have your population in the dark and export energy to Europe. I think this cannot end well. There is another thing which is the risk in those unproven technologies. And speaking from the World Bank, I think what we really would like to see is to have the risks in high-income countries. So we shouldn't have the risks of the tests of those technologies that are not proven supported by the population of Namibia and Mauritania. So I think in the way those contracts are being written, we have to be very careful to be fair in terms of risk sharing. I want also to flag the fact that in those governments, capacity is a big challenge. So you might have only a few people in ministries. If they are spending their days putting together a project to export energy to Europe, they are not working on expanding energy access to their population. So we have to be very careful that we don't suck all of the energy and all of the capacity of those governments at the expense of local populations. You mentioned the challenge of the electricity grid in developing countries. This is a challenge, but I think we have to be a little bit careful here because those challenges are not linked to the shift to renewable that we see here. We have about 800 million people without electricity, mostly because fossil fuels are difficult to bring to people living in very low density remote communities because the grid becomes very expensive. The way we're seeing this right now is the use of renewables with mini grids that at the end of the process can be connected into a national grid. But instead of the process we saw in high-income countries where you create this big network in a very top-down manner, we sort of see a different approach now with decentralized energy production where you start local with mini grids meeting relatively small demands, and then you increasingly connect those mini grids to get to this national level grid. But the process would be very different from what we saw in higher income countries. Last point, to me, exporting energy is not very easy, right? Electricity, you have big losses. Hydrogen, we have discussed all of the complexities, which I think a lot of people underestimate enormously. I think what we might see more and more are those industrial hubs in places with a lot of renewable energy, cheap renewable energy. And as I said, more of an export of steel and construction materials than an export of energy directly, except in some niches like ammonia. the potential of renewable is very well distributed in the world. What is the big constraint is land. And I think countries will have to make a choice, right? If they can't make land available for the grid and renewable energy, they will have expensive renewable energy, and they will be at a disadvantage in industrial terms. Today, we see the challenges in countries. So you mentioned Europe, but in South Asia, where population densities are very high, we have the same type of challenges to just find the space to create renewable energy. And that increases the costs, that delays the project, and that puts countries at a disadvantage compared with Brazil or Mauritania or Namibia, where the land is plenty. But I think this is mostly a political choice. In the US, we need about like 50,000 square kilometer for renewable energy. Everybody's screaming this will be very, very difficult. It's not that different from the surface of a golf course in the country, and it's really, really tiny compared with the land we use to do ethanol. So the size compared with other things is not that big. Just you really need processes that make it possible to build this renewable energy. But if you imagine that the future is a world where you co-locate renewable energy production, electrolyzers for hydrogen, heavy industries for steel and cement, so that you minimize the cost of transport and the losses in transports, which I think is a very likely outcome, then deciding on how we manage those projects and how we manage land availability is really important. And I want to finish on this. Things like agrivoltaics, where you combine PV with agriculture, for instance, could be a complete game changer, because then you don't have this competition between agriculture and solar PV, and it makes everything much easier. But this is clearly a challenge for the industry to access this renewable energy at an acceptable price, and we often neglect this problem of land. And it's the price of land and the process, how to get authorized, because in many cases projects get delayed by 5-7 years just because it takes a long time to get the authorization to build renewable energy projects. So I think I'll stop here, but of course there's much more to say, but let me stop here. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Stefan. Already a lot for us to digest. And Thomas, you also want to add something?
Yeah, just some quick comments from my side. Yes, I fully agree, and it's exactly the point. It's a question of land. We have restricted land in Europe, and we've discussed recently with Austrian mayors. Yeah, calculated. Hey guys, you just have to take the land from your municipality to produce PV power in the range of 2 football courts per each Austrian municipality, and then it goes much easier. And the answer was never ever. And this is unfortunately the point. This is the way how we discuss it. We discuss a lot with the Austrian transmission grid operator how they can do to build up the grids in future. And yesterday I have spoken with someone from an area here in Austria, the Mürztal, and he told me we will have a civil war if this will come. And this is exactly how we see energy transition here in Austria. So as I said, much we can, the more we can do, the better. The less imports we will need. But I'm sorry, I'm afraid. I don't wanna be here the party crasher, but I don't want to be so naive to say that we can do this till 2040. Sorry. So we will have to think carefully about this kind of imports on renewable gases. And here, second comment from my side, there is imports and imports. So when you look on Northern Africa, for instance, when you look on other regions which are quite close to Europe and where there is also plenty of space available, then you can transport those gases to Europe via pipeline and pipelines. And when you compare the cost structure between, I don't know, renewable ammonia and gas which comes directly via pipelines, that there is a factor in between. And this also can help. So there is not Chile and Europe. There is other options and Europe, which are probably cheaper, and we have to work on that, I would say. And probably a positive point at the end, when you look on the projects, this is just a little recap. We have heard this before. When you look on the projects which are established on a global scale, don't underestimate them. There is a lot to come. There is a lot to come. We are in contact with guys from Australia. We are in contact with guys from Northern Africa, and they all speak about the development of renewable project in the gigawatt scale. And this is, I would say, just the start. So I know it is a complex puzzle, but I'm at the end relatively positive that we can manage it. Thank you.
One, since we are already over time, but I don't want to say we have monopolized some of the discussion, and also want to recognize another board member here, Thomas Steiner. Thanks for coming, Thomas. What are the kind of one or two urgent questions you think I would like to ask it? Otherwise, I think there's always a possibility to approach you via email. What would be, say, to something what you would like to ask, but don't feel obliged to ask, but don't feel obliged to well, if there's something which comes to your mind, but say, oh gosh, I've never thought about it. This is really an issue.
Maybe just one comment. Of course, today's discussion is about energy, and so there's a tendency to get a bit lost in the discussion of the energy as the resource. But there are other input factors that also play a role in the end. So the availability of water, for instance, land we just heard, and in one of the keynotes we also heard the importance of keeping nature alive. So there is not like this using all the land for energy production. So let's also keep maybe this in the back of our heads when we're talking about energy, because just the energy won't help us making any steel or making any food or and so on. So we will, we'll have a more difficult picture than than even before.
I fully agree with that. Even with a windmill, you know, when you're planted in Austria, you have to count the beds which the windmill, or you have this kind of protection of environment which exists everywhere. But I think we take care of it, fully understood that. But what are the kind of things? I think a number of major elephants have been hinted out, which has to do with the grids, which we don't have at the moment at the level what we need, with the problem of yes, sounds nice to import it from elsewhere, but your point, you know, did we ask them whether they want to export it, or what is the kind of incentives there to other parts which we have to cope with? One thing which typically finds less of a discussion point is the question of, okay, we talk about wind and sun, and what else? So the question of nuclear in Austria is a no-go, but there are other ways in order how to think about the future, be it fusion technology or low density, other production of generation of nuclear energy in other places. So at the moment, we're pretty much focused on two nowadays ways, it's sun or wind, and the rest, how to say, falls out of the discussion, which I find a little bit sad, because I don't think only wind and sun will do it. If you think about others. So something else from your side before we can close? Yes, please.
I have a short question, because it was striking when Stefan mentioned that in certain countries there is also a lack of knowledge, a lack of people capable of developing renewable energy or building up all the power plants or the technological facilities needed. My question would be, do you see a certain link or also an opportunity between that issue and the other major issue, which is also a standing topic between Europe and other countries in Africa, the migration issue? Have you developed any ideas or plans how this could be perhaps linked so that, for instance, legal pathways for people coming to Europe, being trained in Europe in the renewable energy sector, also for the purpose of going back then to develop renewable energy in their own country. So this would be an issue which is certainly also on the table, and I think the World Bank has probably also developed some reflections on that.
Do you want me to come in on this? I think it's a really important point.
I've just one, comment basically, and I would also like to thank Stefan for his presentation, where he the part of his presentation where he alluded to the macroeconomic impact, because we here in the central bank are of course very much interested in that. But I really wonder, because this is something that we here and our colleagues at the ECB have been tried to assess in more detail, and I think there's one issue about the type of the right model, and you yourself said that you have been using some CGE models, and as far as they always start from a very stable equilibrium, and then if you have this assumption about a stable capital labor ratio and stuff like that already plugged into your model, and at the same time you know that these huge investments that are necessary to bring forth the transition that we need, probably or maybe will change these ratios, then you're in uncharted territory. And that is, all your models that are based on historical time series are not really valuable anymore. And I wonder whether you have been thinking about working on some new types of models, because that's something I think that we really need to assess the macroeconomic impact of these changes.
I think, yeah, I think indeed we would be very interested if you could elaborate a little bit on that. I saw that you have a recent paper with some co-authors also on a new modeling framework. So maybe you could elaborate a little bit on the suite of models that you are using there. Thank you.
Stefan.
So let me touch on that, and on the modeling. I think we could definitely have a session on that, because it will be difficult to cover it in 2 minutes. But I think there are two dimensions here. I think you're making a good point that the models that we're using for most of the macro work really struggle to capture the type of issues we're dealing with here. And I think it's great that we're doing some development of different types of models which are better able to represent those mechanisms. In pure operational terms, a way that we have been trying to use is to start with what exists, and to start with what people are using already, and to go step by step, because it's much easier for us when we engage with people to start with the tools that they are using already, and to then go step by step, instead of arriving and saying, hey, we have this brand new, completely different modeling approach that you should mobilize. So we have this two-track approach, one maybe more fundamental, looking at the theoretical issues, and one which is much more about how to mobilize all of the different tools in a way that makes sense. And what we have been doing for our CCDRs is not to have the macro model replace what the sectoral models are telling us. So very often what you get is you have a CGE model with a super simple energy module, a super simple water module, and basically our colleagues working on each of those sectors are really upset because they feel we're missing all of the granularity and what matters. So what we have been doing instead is this hybrid approach where we do the modeling sector per sector, and we get the results in terms of energy mix, water availability, consumption of fossil fuels, investment needs, and then we force the CGE to follow those sectoral tracks. And the CGE is basically modeling everything else, but for the key sectors, water, energy, transports, we're relying on the technical models from the sectors. And I think the value of that is that we can start from a situation that's not optimal. So we can take into account the fact that in our countries, really the current situation is so suboptimal that you have a lot of opportunities to do better that are kind of like difficult to capture with some of the macro models. But also we can represent non-price policies, which are always a big challenge to represent in macro models. It's very easy to put a carbon price in your model and see what happens. But when you have the type of policies we see in the world today with industrial policies, subsidies, mandates, putting those policies in a macro model is very, very hard. We can do that very well in our sectoral models. So by combining sectoral models and macro models and to create basically consistent storylines, combining those different models, we can answer the question, when we add all of the investment needs in all sectors, does it make sense? Or do we get like 600% of GDP and it makes no sense because at the macro level, it's not doable? What are the second round effects in terms of crowding out other investments in the productive sector? But we're doing that not with a macro model that does all of the work. The macro model starts where the sectoral models stop. So I'm happy to just talk more about this if you're interested. On the capacity question, I think it's also really important. 2 points. First, if you look at how China got big in solar, what they did is they had Chinese people working in the US and Europe that they brought back in China to create this industry. So I think it's a good point that the migration of workers has been absolutely critical to disseminate those technologies and get us the boom in solar. I think if we want this energy exchange to work, I cannot stress enough the need for local populations to benefit. And that, of course, has a link with migrations and with the global geopolitics. Today in Africa, if you want to create a small company, you need $5,000 for a generator because the grid has power outages every day. So it's completely unreliable. This has massive impact on jobs. So if we want people to have a good life in their country, they need jobs. To have jobs, they need firms. To have firms, they need electricity that's reliable. If when we do those projects, like we see between Namibia and Germany, we forget this part of making sure we support the local economy to create jobs and so on, this is not going to work. First, we have those migration that are hard to manage. But second, you will have a backlash if people feel like their country is producing a lot of energy, but it's all going into Europe and doesn't benefit local populations. We saw that in many countries already. So I think it's really, really important those contracts, those deals are not only from an importer perspective, but also have development benefits. And that's where at the World Bank, we're trying to talk to people in Europe and in the US interested in that, because we can help make sure that those projects are also good development projects locally. And to me, it's a key for success.
I think this is a very nice note to enter. Couldn't be better. Thanks again for both of you to be here. 3, the other one I will have to leave her. I hope we can distribute your slides and among here the participants also further to World Bank people, to the Austrian bank people, and I do hope that the contacts remain there. I think very good inputs. There's still many strands which needs to follow up, so it won't be the last time we'll contact you. And in the meantime, we'll try, how to say, to work along some of these areas. And if you have ideas to say, okay, why don't you look at this? You're a specialist of that. Please contact us. Happy to take this up and we'll be able to solve it. We don't know because we also have fluctuating membership in our core team, but we'll try to compensate for that. Okay. Thank you very much. Thanks a lot. Thank you.